Okay, hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So we're going to be reading about China. We're going to be reading a section of Cuba, the evaporation myth, where basically this kind of proves that Cuba was a sugar colony. We're going to start off with the China and Cuba dispute, all the way down to basically talking about where was it? All the way from 95.1% of the hot dog vendors counter-revolutionary. We're gonna be going all the way down to there. So, let's get to the China and Cuba dispute. An incident between the Cuban and Chinese governments in 1966 shows how fast Cuban leaders were going down the road to neocolonial dependence, and how much, all despite their revolutionary rhetoric, their politics were increasingly dictated by the laws of capitalism. China had doubled its shipments by the law. China had doubled its shipments of rice to Cuba for the year of 1965. The Cuban government requested, but when Cuba's government demanded that China maintain the level permanently, the Chinese government responded by saying they were willing to talk about it, but had some serious objections. China's aid and trade is fundamentally different from that of Soviet revisionists described earlier. China's aid is not an investment. Since China is ruled by the working class and not the bourgeoisie, China's aid and trade does not serve the profitability criterions, it serves the proletarian politics. It is based on equality and mutual benefit. The Cuban government offered to pay for the increase of rice shipments with sugar. And if the Chinese weren't interested in that with the cash that China had loaned the Cubans to help them diversify their economy, China answered that with the sugar might be worth in the terms of money, they had no need for so much sugar, while they did need for rice. It was needed not only for their own consumption, but to prepare stockpile in case of war. China had recently been attacked by India, in which was armed and backed by both the US and the USSR, and also to supply Vietnam at their war with the US imperialists. China's own bitter experience after its liberation, had taught it economic dependence is a condition that revolution must end on obstacle, a burden to the people. The Cuban people's rice nation had stayed the same even when China's rice shipments had doubled, because the Cuban government was ripping up rice fields to plant sugarcane, since rice was not as content as sugar according to the profitability principles. Chinese aid had been meant to only help Cuba break out of the sugar chains. To buy rice with it would only make the situation worse. Castro's response was to use occasions of a Havana conference of some revolutionaries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to publicly lash out at China for economic aggression, quote unquote. There, he had also made disgusting personal slanders on Mao Zedong, called for his removal from office, In the context of the USSR's own attacks on China and the polemics then raged between the parties of the two countries over the general line of the international communist movement. This put Castro in particularly good standings with his Soviet creditors, to a truly disgusting example of how the profitability criterion ruled Cuban politics. Nationalization, for what purpose, you ask? Alright, let me get something. Okay. Nationalization, but for what purpose? Of course, this wasn't the way Castro presented every step, every measure that the government took was explained to the masses as a step forward towards quote unquote socialism, better yet, towards communism. But every new nationalization, every new revolutionary quote unquote offense, if every new opportunity presented to the masses to show their quote unquote revolutionary enthusiasm was in fact guided by the creation of profitability in the class interests of the Cuban rulers in 1963. A few months after Castro's visit to the USSR and signing a deal of sugar, Castro announced, in addition to the great estates of the property of the U.S. imperialists, which had been seized before now the land of the medium growers was to be confiscated, those affected growers with 160 to 990 acres, about 10,000 farmers and their families, were all excused by Castro of sabotage of sugar production, quote unquote, and aiding the CIA. These were certainly not poor peasants that could have been relied upon the struggle to transform Cuba, because they were exploiters themselves. Nevertheless, of these farmers had supported the 1959 revolution because they had been severely restricted by the big sugar companies. We cannot say exactly what would have been correct policy towards these growers. The real point is not whether the particular policy towards them was a mistake or not. Mistakes needed not to be fatal and can be corrected given an overall correct line. An important point is, for the Cuban government, this policy was not at all based on how to develop socialist agriculture. It wasn't even a matter of defense of the revolution. For them, it was this complete exportation was a reflection of what had become their overall policy: sacrifice everything to the subordinate of the maximum, the subordinate the subordinate the maximum amount of land to the sugar mills and make cane grow as cheaply as possible. This exact same line all turned out the country into an affected sugar production operation came out differently when applied to several hundred thousands of poor farmers, as people who grew so much of Cuba's food. Their peasants were potentially an important force in development of the economy, and this along with the socialist line, but the government's general policy is not to lead them voluntarily collectivization of the land and labor. They didn't collectivize. Basically, they just let them sit somewhere out of business and became a part of the state farms, which a few grew rich. All caused this part of the economy to stagnate in small private ownership, and Cuba still continued to have spent 24% of its import money on food. This was ignored by Cuban leaders who saw the motivative force in their economy not as the masses mobilized to break the old pattern of production to build socialism, but as to break old pattern but as to the profit creation to get rich quick gimmick of pushing the sugar export section of the economy. The failure leads to these peasants through cooperation, collectivization, and socialization ensured that these sections of the ensured that this section of the people would remain stuck in a method outlook of small private ownership. The Cuban agriculture did not develop a socialist way. The state farm was formed in the old estates, confiscated mediums farms, where it turned grouped together into a giant acropot. Can't pronounce that word. Often totaling in several hundreds of thousands of acres. This was more, quote unquote, more efficient and more profitable way to grow sugar, especially with the market now expanding to include the Soviet Union. But it wasn't higher and a more socialist form of ownership than before because the relations of production, especially the role of the producers in the whole setup, was unchanged. Instead of working for a sugar company under the eyes of a few managers, now the mill workers and the field hand worked for the government under the eyes of 20 or 30 bureaucrats, and proposed their labor remain the production of profit. After a few years, when the state farms needed even more manpower for sugar, the state farmed employees were forbidden to have even their private plots, on which many Cuban cane cutters grew small amounts of vegetables and other crops principally for their own use. Under socialism, the working class strive to make the most efficient use of resources of society. In the long run of the means course, large-scale mechanization, and diversified agriculture, at all the times the working class must wage a political struggle against the capitalist tendencies. The small-scale production engenders, but for a long period of time in many countries, certainly in Cuba, it is either necessary nor desirable to estimate a sideline agricultural production. Even when some produce is sold, it can contribute to feeding people, and if the state farm workers could grow much of their own food in their spare time, it would be a good thing, freeing up resources to use elsewhere. But for some Cuban governments, these private plots took time away from the main business, sugarcane. In effect, the government had become the new landlords and subordinates, and the laborers to needed of society of the demands of the king sugar, just as before. Ugh. 95.1 of the hot dog vendors, quote unquote, counter revolutionary. The shortage of manpower in the sugarcane fields caused a mantle of nationalization in the late 60s in the so called Revolutionary Offensive of 1968. When sugar harvest was way behind, Castro announced that 95.1% of all hot dog sellers, grocery store owners, barkeepers, and other small proprietors had been discovered to be counter revolutionaries. Oh my god, this is just balls to the wall, just funny. Worse, these were able-bodied men were floating while women went to the fields, and all establishments of 55,000, and all these were seized. They were, for instance, the workers might need a lot of lauded dog stand in front of a factory, or else ran by bureaucrats, while expropriators were sent off to cut cane. Some turned out to be old and crippled, and many joined. Almost 10% of the Cuban population had fled the country. Castro justified this by saying the revolution hadn't been made just so the quote unquote parasites could run a business, but his approach to this question was the opposite. The proletariat and the revolution led by the working class. It is important to the political principle to win over the maximum numbers of forces against the enemy at each point in the struggle to neutralize those who can be won over. The working class has seized power from the big capitalists, has gradually do away with the small proprietors, in the midst of who represented a capitalist element. But the working class method in the situation used persuasion, not force, and the working class can win the vast majority of these people to building socialism. In the course of this transformation, both their political outlook and their economic position, but Castro's capitalism turned out into wage slaves, pure and simple. For the Cuban government, it was simple matter of economics. 50,000 able-bodied men, 55,000 able-bodied men, and 55,000 potential cane cutters. This nationalization was the greatest fraud and had nothing to do with socialism. Even the government might have pronounced it's very quote unquote revolutionary to do away with someone else's business to serve its own Nationalization is not necessarily socialization. Nationalization means simply control of business by the state, which the bourgeois state does all the time. From the post office to Penn Central in the US to the steel industry of the mines in Britain, the key difference in which the class holds power when the working class runs the state to its able planned society, increasingly to serve its own interests of all humanity to do its required. Increasing conscious had organized participation of the workers at the level of society, including enterprise and level of management and administration. The masses of workers and peasants have a great knowledge about production and overall particular needs with leadership of the proletariat's party. Their knowledge can be summed up to use to formulate a plan to run the economy in order to fill those needs and advance the revolution. The masses of producers can be organized and educated and relied and increasingly control and participation in carrying out this plan and run society. Until all this is done, there is not only one other way to make decisions according to the profit. This is the case in Cuba. Their periodic assemblies of workers in the factories, all right. But the top government and officials explained it's not questioning all the discussion of the Ministry of Decisions. The thing is, enthusiasm of the workers must be attained by the support of the principal measures and administration. This is a very different thing from a kind of management pep talks workers in the U.S. often hear. The factories, state farms, hot dog stands, etc., weren't run by a plan. In a working class sense of the word, plans were made, but since the general line of the economy were already planned and decided by production of sugar, particular plans within that had followed suit to also based on profits, but it was a very important difference between the management of the economy in the 60s and its present management in the 60s. The managers and the bureaucrats were subject to the control and the discipline of the regarding members of the regarding in their particular enterprise or industry in the name of establishing quote unquote communism all at once with the freedom of the they thought Soviet aid. There was no economic accounting for the performance of little control except for the superior orders. This allowed the former intellectuals and professionals who were running the economy to trip out pretty much a day like with special projects, quote unquote, so called mini plans, free as birds until the bills for this freedom came quickly due. All this of the name of socialism, the name of eliminating the vile intermediary of of money, as Castro explained. But the real socialist construction, with both the force of production and the knowledge of the conscious control of producers, are still relatively limited. The working class must use some economic accounting and control over production in order to better understand if it is free to do and to help check up on its implementation. Again, this means the subordinating econo- economics to to politics. Otherwise, it's the plan. If the plan doesn't strictly reflect in reality and it isn't strictly carried out, then the laws of capitalism will reassert themselves while the new managers and the bureaucrats wanted to be free of the vile intermediary of money. They could be free of the laws of capitalism and the market and the uncontrolled nature of production. Under this system, which has created very severe economic setbacks and contributed to a lot of the failure of the sugar harvest, had brought under the discipline of profit, as first commanded by the economy through indirect intervention of Castro and the other leaders who ran directing to promise a quick return on investment, and then later in the 60s the government tried to run everything with the aid of a giant Soviet computer and set of mathematical tables preparing accordingly. The billboard exports Cuban achieved a goal of 6 million tons of sugar by June 10th, promised it would blow Uncle Sam. Castro stalked in honor of the revolution and important of the most Cuban resource of the success of 1970, 10 million in tons campaign. It's a failure, left the economy in shambles, and the country further hawked into the USSR's social imperialism. To instruct of the Harvard economists, since the methods arranged for the maximum efficiency as measured in pesos and centavos, they were simply disguised as for a running things according to profit, and in fact often used by capitalist management in the US and USSR by the early 1970s. However, even if these methods turned out to be not efficient enough, piece by piece, the government began reorganizing the economy according to the same principle in form as well as content, followed by dollar, especially the ruble. The real relations of production and the real class relationship with a camouflage by the fast and loose up of Marxist words. At the same time, the workers and peasants were expected to work double time in honor of this phony Marxism. Quote unquote voluntary labor, the new man using the cosines to create wealth and creating the new man, the worker were increasingly called upon to do great amounts of voluntary labor. This was especially true in the late 60s as growing numbers of the cane cutters streamed out of the countryside looking for better pay and conditions, leaving all important sugar harvests to short manpower and enormous numbers of workers and students and even sometimes bureaucrats busted into the cane fields. However, little resemblance to real socialist voluntary work, which under working class rule is important to measure for the development of the society in transforming the working class under socialism when the workers rule and transformation society towards communism. There is a real basis for people spending their spare time doing voluntary labor, but in Cuba, the voluntary labor was nothing like this. This was because as they needed sugar production, meant that people quote unquote voluntary labor was often at the expense of their regular work. because all it all was often at the expense of the regular wait. All through many people did take part in the enthusiastical and selflessly logged a certain number of hours of quote unquote voluntary labor was the only way to become eligible to buy durable consumer goods such as refrigerators and etc. Many workers resisted this scheme. Productivity in voluntary labor was often only 10% of the paid labor, but it was still cheaper than the paid wages, just as Castro claimed that the increasing concentration on sugar was necessary for the and to fully develop the productive forces necessary for quote unquote communism, and he claimed that the increasing emphasis emphasis on voluntary labor was a communist measure. In fact, as many workers were becoming very skeptical about how things were going under quote unquote socialism throughout the 60s, Castro made increasing use to the promise that communism would come in the very near future, starting with 10 years. He said it would put an end to Cuba's growing problems. This was very convenient misuse of what communism really means, as well as the pure pie in the sky, as development quickly proved. No amount of labor, voluntary or otherwise, will change the capitalist class relations with the real cause of Cuba's capitalist with Cuba's problems, and the Cuban government was using all sorts of devices from perverting people real revolutionary enthusiasm to material incentives to outright wage cutting to disguise this fact and squeeze more and more labor out of the people in industries, especially among skilled workers, and wage for a great many jobs were cut under the slogan of workers renounce gains, which today constitute as privileges. Many times Castro has denounced so-called privileges that some workers supposedly enjoyed under Batista, as well as supposedly enjoyed under workers in the US today, but it's the capitalists who cause inequalities among the working people, not fundamental by favoring some, but by paying all as little as they can to get away with the socialist principle, each according to its work, means that people do receive different pay for every work because they contribute different amounts to society. Restricting differences and eventually doing away with them must overwhelmingly be done by raising general wage level, by not forcing wage cutting. It's a capitalist ideal of equality that all workers should be equally poor and some workers should pay whether for advances and others to make. This is too the Cuban government's idea of quote unquote building socialism. And communism sustainously. Meanwhile, of course, the class difference widened while the workers took a pay cut in the name of building really pure society. High school teachers, for instance, got 60% wage hike on the new plant, and managers will be paid for their profit performance. Even so, wages were not what they seem. Rent was cheap and even free for some. Many prices at the time were cheaper than before, but by the end, the 60s consumer goods were so scarce that the amount of money in circumcision twice the value of goods available on the market, much people pay was worthless because there was nothing to spend on since they have been then this had been solved by raising prices. The economy in shambles. In the late 60s, the Cuban economy was in shambles. In 1964, after signing sugar sales agreements to the Soviet Union had announced by 1970, Cuba has harvest 10 million sugar tons a year. This plan meant almost tripling the sugar production. A high 30% of the economy was being plowed back into capital investment, focusing on clearing the land for cane by buying tractors for cane, building new mills for cane, railroads for cane, ports for cane, as well as expanding other exports and crops and nickel mining for exports after first two sugar productions began to fall farther and farther behind the targeted goals, and more sugar fell behind, and more frankly other resources were thrown into sugar production, with workers draw out every other into other industry production, with workers drawn onto industry. Even housing was left standing, half built, as the workers were snatched away to cut cane. But this plan turned out to be a nightmare and the Cuban rulers were in deep trouble in their front size efforts to make the goal upon which Castro had very publicly staked and honor the revolution. They so burned out men, machines in the fields. 8.5 million tons was achieved in 1970, came at such cost that next 2 years cane production fell. In recent Cuban history, and not only did they get 10 million tons by 1970, they had fallen so far behind sending sugar promises the Soviet Union. They owed the Soviet Union 10 million tons. Cuba's economic statistics for this period was painted in a picture of disaster. The country's industrial production had risen to somewhat until 1968, when sugar production began to reach a fever pitch, then fell very sharply. According to Cuban figures, steel and shoe production, for instance, dropped like stone. Non-sugar agricultural production fell by a fifth. Cuban statistics quoted by the UN, the number of cattle from 7 million to 5 million in 3 years. Cuba's popularity in many vegetables scarce. According to the American quote-unquote experts on the subject, statistics showed the standards of living of the masses was slowly falling for the late 60s. We don't have to take their words for it, because the Cuban government amount of good people could get under rationing, they either stayed the same or decreased, as in the case of milk. Even the person of our consumption of Cuba, two most famous products, sugar and cigars, was drastically cut, more left over for exports, while the prices of many consumers and items rose sharply. That the workers didn't care for what ways things were going. It was shown by the admissions by the Cuban Minister of Labor that absenteeism from the work was 20% on average a day. Average day in 1970. He describes this as a widespread passive resistance to the Cuban masses. The government had promised 10 million tons harvest would produce an abundance necessary for the Cuban economic liberation, But this drive is a failure and had further enslaved Cuba's people. By 1970, the Cuban government owed the USSR almost $2 billion. The Soviets were demanding more and more pounds of flesh in return. They basically did that. They basically did that. And I'll read this last part before the parties roll. This will be the last part. The Cuban Party Congress consultation for malrefaction of many changes the Cuban government has made since the early 70s. First, most important, there was a new crackdown on the working class alongside new wage policy described as the beginning of this article. There is now a less emphasis on relying on the masses' enthusiasm, more on plain old force line in the 1973 decision, which revised the system of punishment familiar to the workers throughout the capitalist world for offenses ranging at statism, latelessness, negligence, or to respect supervisors. Workers can be punished by docking their paychecks, being disqualified for certain posts, transferred for other jobs, and postponements of vacation, temporary suspension, or actual firing. Individual sugar enterprises started laying off workers several years to increase productivity, quote unquote. The president Dorcos admitted that in 1972 speech that there was some outright unemployment in two of the largest sugar-growing provinces. Now, according to the party Congress, in practice to become more widespread in the industries, the decision in the Congress established formal system of running the Cuban economy alongside capitalist lines. Bureaucrats and managers won't be so free to damage profit with the fantasies of money can't buy the whole economy. Oh wait, the fantasies ever more sense that the freedom even the social imperialist money can't buy. The whole economy is run more efficiently now with the profit to be made at every step. Workers are to be paid accordingly to profitability of the enterprises they work for to make them work harder, and which won't make them any less exploited. Managers are to pay accordingly to profitability for the enterprises they manage to make the work of the workers harder, and those at the top are paid the rewards for the results. After all, they don't have the responsibility of running everything, question mark. So basically, this was all for literally the Soviet social imperialists. And to the detractors of mine who are going to say this, you're not Cuban, you haven't been to Cuba. Motherfucker, I'm part Cuban. The other thing is, oh my god, this is complete nonsense. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. No, it's not. They proved statistics. They literally talked about how their plan was to produce 10 million tons of sugar. They owed the USSR $2 billion. $2 billion for this shit. Basically, the USSR basically put themselves into a debt trap for the Soviet social imperialists to now become a colony of them. And the quote unquote that Castro was a Marxist, he only called himself a Marxist Leninist in the 60s. That's when. Even Che Guevara criticized him in his last letter, saying he shouldn't have trusted him. And I'll put more sources in the link down in the description. I'll put this and also the other sources as well in the link down in the description. They were literally asking the Chinese to give them more rice. And the Chinese were like, no, motherfucker, like, this is not an investment. We're just giving this as mutual benefit and mutual aid to you guys. Hey, how about start diversifying? And also, like, even Mao gave them that advice. You know what Castro did? He got into a hissy fit and got mad at Mao, and then he started doing that shit. And one of the conferences I mentioned earlier in the video, where he was asking for Mao to be ousted. What the hell? This is some bullshit. Mao was right. Mao was completely right. The RCP is completely right. Gonzalo was right. Gonzalo was right about Castro. Che was right about Castro. This is revisionism 101. And whoever keeps repeating this line to me in the comments section is going to repeat this line to me in the comments section. You need to self-criticize right now. This is your last chance to self-criticize on this. Now. Start doing it. Now, after I just gave you the proof and resources. And also, to be in good faith, just please read it. Just please read it. Ugh. But, thanks for watching, guys. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.